Hello, today I am doing a short video on how to use correct terminology when discussing the history of physical culture and exercise. Now, shockingly, most of the academic papers, books, and theses that I read online about the history of exercise often don't understand the most basic terminology, but they think they do, and so they will mix things up and confuse stuff all the time. And this causes them to draw false conclusions about history. So if you actually sit through this video, congratulations. No matter how much of a layman you are, you will have an advantage over most of the scholars and grad students out there who are writing about this stuff. And the different terms we're going to tackle today and define in the context of history are the following. We have exercise, athletics, gymnastics, rational gymnastics, gymnastic with a K, turning, physical culture, and physical education. Now, you might think you know what these are or that they all seem like pretty much the same thing, but they're not, though they are, of course, related. But it's very important to know the differences if you want to understand the history of exercise. So to start, exercise. I often get a lot of comments on my YouTube channel. For instance, when I'm discussing something like the earliest exercise method ever in a certain country, people will then comment things like, "That's not true. People have been exercising for thousands of years before that. People got exercise from just walking around in the farm or going on a long walk." So yes, in modern times, exercise can simply refer to any type of exertion in life. But let's take a look at the historical definition from Bailey's 1776 dictionary, which actually comes in surprisingly handy for the research that I do. And so in 1776, it is described as, quote, exercise, the motion or stirring of the body in order to health, end quote. So it's not just any type of exertion, it is an activity that one deliberately and consciously engages in to cultivate health. Pretty simple, pretty broad. Next term, athletics. Once again, in the 1776 dictionary, athletics is described as, quote, belonging to the art of wrestling, champion-like, lusty, strong. A century later, in 1879, Hunter's dictionary describes athletics as, quote, the art of developing muscular strength for the sake of prize or other contests, or for the ordinary physical work of life. So athletics is specifically associated with strength cultivation, often for the purposes of engaging in contests or competitions. So it's much more specific than exercise. Which brings us to our next term, gymnastics, a very important one. So today, most people associate gymnastics with the sport of doing flips and swinging on rings and bars, etc. In 1776, it's described as, quote, that part of physic which teaches how to preserve health by exercises. So now we're not just talking about the activity of developing strength. We're talking about the art and science, a methodology really, for cultivating health through exercise. So the objective is different. It's health instead of strength, it's more specific than athletics. Again, 1819, Bartholomew Parr's dictionary, gymnastics is defined as, quote, exercises of the body which were proposed for the restoration and preservation of health and for the cure of diseases. They were of Greek origin, gymnastica. So this is an ancient classical term. And indeed, the major gymnastic methods of the 19th century all took significant inspiration from ancient Greece and Rome, some basing their philosophies directly on them. So gymnastics can essentially encompass any specialized athletic, artistic activity, including the martial arts. Chopping wood or going on a long walk might be considered exercise, but not gymnastics. Which brings us to yet another, even more specific term, rational gymnastics. Now, you encountered this term a lot during the 19th century and may not realize that it is a reference to a very specific method, the Swedish method of Per Henrik Ling, founded at the beginning of the century. Ling took the concept of gymnastics further by creating a holistic system for the cultivation of mind, body, and spirit, which he termed, quote, rational gymnastics. That is, exercise which was not random or aimless, but which was systematic, scientific, and contained an expressed coherent purpose. primarily the cultivation of health. And this method was influential on almost everything that came after in the 19th century. So how is that different than the ordinary gymnastics that everyone else might have been doing? Well, if you went on a jog or you did several dumbbell exercises every day with the specific intention of bettering your health, that could be called gymnastics. But according to the Swedes, that would not be rational gymnastics because it was not a comprehensive, systematic approach to completely balance your entire body in a harmonious way. So the Swedes were very strict and perfectionist in the way that they looked at it. Next term, physical culture. This is probably one of the most common and important terms relating to exercise in the 19th century. And the use of culture in this context, the word culture goes back to the 18th century definition. So in 1755, for instance, Samuel Johnson described culture as, quote, the act of cultivation, the art of improvement or amelioration. So speaking literally, physical culture means the cultivation of the physical. However, the term physical culture comes to have a more specific connotation, referring to the 19th century movements and methods cultivating mind, body, and spirit. But they called it physical culture because the cultivation of the mind and spirit are taking place through physical exercise. So physical culture also touched upon other things than exercise, such as diet, personal hygiene, and dress. I have personally collected a lot of essays that define physical culture from the period, but these are often pages long and tedious to quote here. But some of those I have already made available to our patrons in PDF, and I will continue to collect them as I find them. The next term, turning, comes from the German term turnen. And if you look that up in German to English dictionaries, these will often just translate turning simply as gymnastics. But it was actually much more. So turnen referred to the activity of the German gymnastics school, which encompassed not just one but many methods, all united by Germanic theory, principles, and philosophy. What distinguishes turning from the other aforementioned categories and terms, aside from the technical specifics, is that it was an entire way of life. There was a lot of camaraderie, gatherings, and extracurricular activity involved. And in addition to all the physical exercise, which was admittedly the focus, it encompassed philosophy, singing, debate, pageantry, hiking excursions in nature, theater excursions, drinking excursions, and much more. So turning is a movement and a way of life. Later, in the early 1900s, we have the rise of something else in Germany called gymnastic, spelled gymnastic with a K. And this is confusing because that spelling is simply the word for gymnastics in German, as well as Scandinavian and some of the Eastern European languages. But in the early 1900s, this word gymnastic with a K comes to refer to a very specific movement in Germany which actually disparaged the old Turner methods and basically threw all the old Turner professors under the bus, who the adherents to gymnastic attacked as being too rigid and stiff and militaristic. They advocated these bouncy, sort of flowing motions which use the entire body at all times, rather than any localized motions that the Turners had used. And this basically replaces all the old Turner methods, though it's historically confusing because the Turners also now do gymnastic to a degree in the 20th century. And then in the 1930s, the Nazis take over this movement, this gymnastic movement. One of the main proponents, Rudolf Bode, was a Nazi. So when you see all these German exercise films from the 1930s, it's almost all gymnastic. It's not turning. It's not the Turners. It's significantly different from the 19th century methods. And also I wanted to especially thank my friend David Mastro, who was the first person to tell me about this gymnastic movement. So the last term we will address today is one that everybody knows, physical education, which is actually a pretty old term. It goes back to around at least 1800, but not used in the same sense that we think of it today. At the time, it referred to diet, hygiene, dress, as well as exercise a little bit, but exercise wasn't the focus. Then around 1860, a guy named Archibald Maclaurin comes along in England and publishes a book entitled Physical Education, which is all about exercise. Still, the term is not as popularly used as gymnastics or physical culture during the 19th century. Then, in the 20th century, physical education becomes the term for what is taught in schools and universities, encompassing elements of fitness and sports. For instance, Merriam-Webster's Dictionary of 1961 defines it thus, quote, "Instruction in the development and care of the body, usually involving training in hygiene and systematic exercises." Sports or competitive games also becomes an important part of physical education when it was only a very minor part, if at all, of the 19th century physical culture methods. And then in the mid-20th century, there was sort of this battle for the soul of physical education, and the sporting camp wins out. And so in the late 20th century, physical education becomes dominated by sports, as it still is today. And if you want to know more about that, check out a interview I did with my friend Ron Jones, a very long interview, and we really go into the history of physical education in the 20th century. And so all of this is why today, for physical exercise, instead of physical education, people mostly use the term fitness, essentially a modern umbrella term for cultivating muscular strength, some cardio health, and flexibility, which is actually a much more narrow focus than pretty much all of the 19th century terms we've discussed. And if you want a more detailed video on the differences between modern fitness and holistic 19th century physical culture, please check out an audio-visual lecture I gave called Fencing and Its Relationship to Physical Culture. And I'll put a link for that below. Anyway, that brings us to the end of this little short lecture. I hope you learned something today about the historical terminology relating to exercise. Thanks and have a great day.